guys, it's Ashley and welcome to day 2 of my 12 days of BOOKMAS. Today we are going to be talking about the books that I read this year that sort of dipped me outside of my comfort zone a little bit. So if you know me and if you've watched my videos for a while, or even if you haven't, you probably already can guess this, my favorite genre is fantasy. I love fantasy anything. I also do occasionally love a good romance, a good sci-fi, and apparently a good murder mystery slash thriller now that I have dipped my toes into that genre a little bit. But there are a couple of genres that I read this year, or books specifically, that sort of took me outside of my comfort zone of fantasy, romance, sci-fi, that sort of thing, even typical YA or middle grade. That's why I wanted to make this video. I do like reading outside of my comfort zone every now and then. Most of the time I stick to what I like and what I know, but every now and then if a book gets like popular enough, or a book gets enough buzz, or I hear a certain thing about it that makes me want to read it, I'll end up picking it up. Sometimes I'll like it. And these are those books. So the first book that I want to make a mention of that sort of took me outside of my comfort zone this year was Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This story follows two different families, both mothers who are very, very different from one another. One of them is a very wealthy white family who lives in Shaker Heights, which is a very upper class neighborhood in Ohio. The other family is just a mother and daughter who are kind of like artistic nomads in a way. They don't really have very strong roots anywhere. They sort of pick up and go whenever they want. This story sort of sets them in contrast against one another, while another story with another mother is playing out and becomes very controversial through this town. I actually read this book at the very beginning of the year, and I buddy read it with my mom, which was one of the only books that she read this year, might I add, because of me, and we both absolutely loved this story. Like, we were both really reading it really fast, and occasionally she would get ahead of me or I would get ahead of her, and we'd try not to spoil it for each other, and it was a really fun time. But I think because I read it with my mom and this story is about like motherhood, I don't know, I felt like connected to it in a way that I probably wouldn't have had I not read it with her. And that's not to say that you need to read this book with your mom to understand what it's about, but it was just something about that I really enjoyed. The reason that I have this on my list is because I don't normally reach for many adult contemporary stories or literary fiction, though I don't know if this falls under that, to be completely honest. And this can also actually be lumped with The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett and Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I tried to sort of venture out into some adult fiction this year, but Little Fires Everywhere was definitely my favorite, which is why I'm featuring it in this video. I did watch the adaptation that they made on Hulu with Kerry Washington and Reese Witherspoon, and I did like it in the beginning, and then toward the end I was like not a huge fan of it and like the direction that they took it in, because they did change a couple of things from the book. Next on this list we have two books that took me very far outside of my comfort zone this year, especially since I've been out of school, and those are Emma and Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. The reason these are on this list is because they are clearly classics, and I'm not a big classics person if you don't know. Back when I was in school and you were forced to read classics or forced to read Shakespeare or anything like that, I did end up enjoying a few of them that I read. I really enjoyed, I think, A Tale of Two Cities. I enjoyed Hamlet. So there were some classics that I did really enjoy, but I never had to read a Jane Austen story. And so I've had these books on my shelves for years. I got these from Anthropology a really long time ago. These are like the hardcovers, and people always ask me where I got them, and I'm sorry, I got them a couple years ago, and now all you can find are the paperback versions of these covers. I had them for so long and I never read them. And so this year I watched the new Emma film with a couple of friends, and I was like, you know what? I should probably read this book. So I decided to, and I did. I really enjoyed it, and then I knew I needed to read Pride and Prejudice next because that's everybody's favorite book, and I really enjoyed that along with the movie that came with that. So yeah, apparently I like classics now. The next story that I want to talk about here is one that I actually haven't mentioned too often on my channel, and that is Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. Now, the reason that I put this one on my, outside of my comfort zone list is because it actually wasn't what I expected, and it wasn't anything like I normally read. If you remember watching my wrap-up when I mentioned this book, I did mention that I thought it was going to be something completely different, because the tagline for this story has something to do with like wizards, and it's like something like I am a teenage wizard or something like that, and it really makes you think that you're going into like a fantasy. I didn't actually read the synopsis, by the way, so that was my bad. Definitely was not fantasy. It's definitely a long sort of extended metaphor throughout the whole story. There are lots of metaphors and lots of like beautiful language and well written verse and prose and whatever you want to call it. It was really good, but it was also really heartbreaking and also touching, but also devastating, but also like hopeful, but also horrible. And it was just like so many contrasting emotions throughout the entire thing that it really threw me for a loop, but by the end of it, I was really happy that I stuck with it and read it. Essentially, the story follows, I believe it's supposed to be like the author's sort of life. I think from what I remember that the main character was named Echo as well, but I can't remember for sure. So the story basically follows her life as she is experiencing all of these different things, good and bad, and all the in-between. It bounces between time periods, it bounces within chapters between time periods. There will be like a paragraph from one time period and a paragraph from the other, and then it'll bounce back and forth between those two and sort of draw a parallel. It's very like interestingly written and very interestingly put together, and also deals with a lot of hard topics like addiction and violence, abuse. I believe there's suicide possibly. I know that there's sexual assault and rape. So it's like a lot of hard things that if you know, suffer from any sort of triggers or need content warnings for anything, definitely look into that before reading this book, but it was really, really, really good. So next up on this list was Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This is a historical fiction story following a couple of teenagers in World War II Germany and Poland and that sort of Eastern Europe, I want to say. Never been one to enjoy historical fiction, to be completely honest with you. I enjoy it when authors who write fantasy take inspiration from historical time periods and stuff like that, but I've never been one to truly enjoy a like 100% historical fiction story. But this one I really, really enjoyed, and it did make me like sob at the end. Like I said, the story follows, I believe it's like 4 different teenagers. They are all in sort of a mixture of trying to flee the war, trying to fight in the war, trying to get out of the war, and there's just like a lot that happens and just a lot of horrible, horrible things. We also follow the story that not many people know about of the sinking of the ships, the Wilhelm, if that's what it's called, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Yeah, apparently there's a like actual factual story about that, about the sinking of those ships that not many people know about, and not many people know the number of people who died during those times and during that horrible tragedy. If you're looking for a really good cry, definitely pick this up. And if you enjoy historical fiction, specifically World War II, which is honestly the only kind of historical fiction that I've ever read. I think I mentioned this once before, but the only other historical fiction I remember truly reading was Night by Elie Wiesel, and that was for school, but that's also surrounding World War II and the Holocaust specifically. So that's the only kind of historical fiction that I've ever read. Apparently I know a lot about World War II now. And then the final book that I want to mention on this list that really dipped me out of my comfort zone this year was 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. This story was really, really good. I know I mentioned it in my video that should have gone up yesterday called The Rest of the Books That I Read in 2020, but this story was really good. It was much better than I thought it was going to be going into it, and I really had no expectations, and it really blew me away. This story follows 2 characters in 2 different time periods who eventually their stories overlap. It takes place in sort of war-torn Afghanistan. So we follow these characters in Afghanistan through a number of years, through the Taliban, through nearly current times, and through like everything that happened before and in between. It's a very tragic story at times, and it's very heartbreaking to see what these women have gone through in Afghanistan during these, you know, horrible, like I said, war-torn times in the country, and how it's really torn everything apart, including the people who live in it. It also at the end is very like hopeful in a way, and it's also pretty heartwarming. As I mentioned with a lot of these sort of sad stories, there's very blatant contrast between, you know, despair and hope in all of these stories. And that's what I really enjoy about most of them. It's that no matter how bleak things can get, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. You should always have hope for something better to come. Or something like that. I'm not gonna say that that's how it is for all of these stories that I'm reading, but something along those lines where there's a very blatant contrast between dark and light, hope and despair. And this was definitely no different. I was reading this book and thinking, oh my god, how are these women surviving this? How are they, you know, still having a positive mindset going forward? How are they, you know, bringing themselves to wake up every morning and just move on? And by the end of it, you know, it was left with a very like touching moment, a very like heartwarming, hopeful moment that things might be okay after all. Definitely a very good story. I know a lot of you have told me that you've read it and absolutely loved it. So if you like reading any kind of stories like that, I would definitely recommend this one. So those were some of the stories that I read this year that took me out of my comfort zone just a little bit. I really do enjoy reading stories that are different from what I normally read from time to time, because I don't want to just stick with one genre or one type of story and like miss out on everything else that I could be reading or could be enjoying if I just gave it a try, you know? So I do like experimenting and branching out every now and then. There are some genres that I'm pretty sure that I would very rarely enjoy, but for the most part, I've pretty much found a book in almost every genre that I have thoroughly enjoyed and would definitely recommend to everybody. But anyway, that's the whole video for you. So if you read any books this year that took you out of your comfort zones, definitely let me know down below and tell me if you would recommend them, if you enjoyed them, if they were a flop. I would love to know. And I think that's going to be it for this video. So thank you guys so much for watching the second day of my 12 days of Bookmas. If you want to follow me on any of my socials, all my handles are in the description, and I will catch you later.